I gave a talk, I think it was last year, on the archaeology of West Cornwall. This is actually more my research line, early shipping. I'm very conscious about various things when I give a talk. One is that I hope you can hear me at the back. If you can't, put your hands up. You can't hear me, or you can hear me. You can. And the other difficulty, which I can't do a lot about, is whether you can see the screen adequately, but that's the best we can do. Now, I'm very conscious that when people start talking about boats and ships, then we have our own vocabulary, and some of it is a bit technical, and I promise to keep that down to a minimum. I won't use any more jargon than I have to, and if I do use any terms, any nautical terms, then I will endeavour to explain them as I go along. Now, I promise as well that the talk won't last more than an hour. Even if I haven't finished, then I'll terminate it, and then I can allow you to ask any questions you want. So we should finish by about 5 to 9, and then if there's any questions, then feel free to ask them. So first of all, why is the history of boat building and seafaring important? Well, obviously, you don't need me to tell you that it's probably the most important aspect of Cornwall. We're virtually totally surrounded by the sea. And ancient ships and seafaring would have to have been important not only in the economy of Cornwall, but in the identity of Cornwall and in the social and economic history of Cornwall as well. So the history of seafaring and what it's done for the county is clearly very, very important. We are totally surrounded by, virtually totally surrounded by the sea. Certainly on the north coast, as you can see from this picture of Gurnard's Head, it can be a very inhospitable coastline. Many vessels have been wrecked on the coastline. I'll say a little bit about those as we go. And by and large, ancient boats really have very little chance of surviving intact, even when they've been sunk. In some places they do, in West Cornwall they don't. Some of you will recognise this photograph. It's Gurnard's Head, or Treen Head. It's significant in terms of early archaeology in that just here there was a rampart, and this was a defended headland site. Now, I'm going to give you two views of Cornwall. There's lots of ways we can look at Cornwall, geographically and politically and socially. From a very English point of view, very British point of view, there's a tendency to see Britain as not only an island, which of course we are, but as the water as a kind of a moat. And Shakespeare himself used that idea in more than one of his plays. This fortress built by nature for herself, against infection and the hand of war, England bound in with the triumphant sea. Yes, we've always tended to see ourselves as an island nation and the water surrounding it as a moat, something to keep us protected in times of fear of invasion and whatever, whether it was Napoleon, whether it was Hitler in the last war. And that is this kind of thinking of the sea that's really permeated much of the British thinking, that we are isolated from the rest of the world by the sea. But archaeologically, that's actually something of a misconception. Because if you go into the past, the sea isn't actually a barrier. The sea is essentially an important conduit for communication and for links with the outside world. And when you look at it that way, you begin to see Cornwall not as the English tend to do, dare I say, as a kind of a remote ligature down here in the sort of heel of the country. If you look at Cornwall from the point of view of seaways, then it's very important because it's an important link with the Mediterranean and the ancient world of the Mediterranean and the whole of northern Europe. And it is interesting that this map, I really grabbed it by chance out of a Barry Cunliffe book. Barry Cunliffe, the great professor of archaeology and the great doyen of modern archaeology in Britain. Barry Cunliffe used this map of Britain actually to illustrate the distribution of, well, what he calls portal dolmens, you and I call quoits. And if you look at the distribution of quoits and portal dolmens, as Cunliffe does, then the one thing that strikes you is their very western distribution. Now it's curious that, in fact, there are no quoits found in lowland England at all. Or, in fact, there are, and I don't understand why Cunliffe didn't put them in. There's a small group on the River Medway in Kent, situated, and they are called the Medway Group. And I can't for the life of me understand why he missed them out, but he did. But leaving them aside, what's significant is that Cornwall links with Wales and Ireland, even in prehistory, with the spread of these portal dolmens. And it makes the point very nicely that our cultural, economic and social ties throughout prehistory and through much of the early medieval period as well are more with what Cunliffe calls the Atlantic seaboard, the western seaboard of Europe, rather than with the mainland. And if you look at it that way, Cornwall takes on a different role. Because if you look at the links with the ancient world, the Mediterranean world, then Cunliffe makes the point that Northern Europe is effectively screened using inland routes by mountain ranges, whether it's the Alps or the Pyrenees, and therefore to make progress and carry goods from the Mediterranean up to the north of Europe and vice versa actually was very difficult using overland routes. Much better, particularly for bulk commodities, is to use a sea route. And if you think of the sea route, and you go through Straits of Gibraltar, up the coast of Iberia, the Bay of Biscay, then you begin to realize that Cornwall, Land's End, is a very important landfall. And rather than seeing it as the English, I think, tend to do, as a kind of a remote part down there in the sort of far southwest, it becomes in ancient terms almost, if you like, a motorway stop. A place where you make your first landfall and where you begin to trade. Now, we know that the ancient world traded with Cornwall for lots of reasons, because there are materials found which have shown the spread of the culture. But we do, by chance, have the account of Pytheas, a Greek traveller and geographer, who recalls a travel that he made from the Mediterranean, landing in Massalia, or Marseille as it is now, across partly the overland route, just east of the Pyrenees, up through the Bay of Biscay, and he made a landfall in what can only be Cornwall. He talks about how pleasant the people were. Well, nothing has changed very much, obviously. Sadly, though, he must just have missed this little dark place on the far side of the peninsula that begins with a P and has a Z in the middle of it. I'm a St Ives man, so you'd understand I have to say that. He does actually say how intelligent these people were and how good they were at trading. He mentions a place called Ictus, which seems to have been a place where tin was smelted and traded, and that is often considered to have been Mount Space, St Michael's Mount, the actual mount itself. He went on around, he went up and he did a tour around the coast of the British Isles, and it seems unbelievably as if he even got as far as Greenland. He describes it in some detail. Now, the important thing is that Cornwall, in that sense, becomes an important stop between Northern Europe and the classical world. So that's by way of saying seafaring was always important and very significant, and our position in terms of seafaring is fundamentally important. So that brings us on to the next question: what do we know about ancient ships? Well, surprisingly, quite a lot. But if I tell you that Barry Cunliffe, I always use this quote when I give a talk on ancient times, Barry Cunliffe said we must be aware that the past is in truth unknowable. The best we can do is to offer an approximation based on fragments. And obviously, the further back you go, the fewer the fragments and the smaller they are, so the more difficult it is to reconstruct the past accurately. And that's certainly true of boats. But having said that, it's surprising what evidence there is and what different sources there are available. And then if I want to tell you that the number of ancient ships or boats found off West Cornwall is actually 0, then you can imagine that I'm in for a very difficult 45 minutes. But actually all is not lost, because there are sources available for ancient ships, and by the very nature, of course, boats and ships travel from one part of the world to another. So I'm going to give the evidence that has been gleaned over 100 years of archaeology, really, to formulate an idea of the way boats have developed in Northern Europe over time. And of course, because they move over large distances, the sort of boats I'm describing, even the ones found, I'm going to show you an example of one in Denmark, certainly travel to Cornwall. So the vessels that have been found in other parts of Northern Europe would almost certainly have been seen around the coasts of Cornwall. Now, there are basically two sources of information for ancient boats and ancient ships. One is what I call, and I've called in various papers I've written, the primary source material. And the primary source material is the boat itself, or what's left of the boat. So the actual primary source material, and that's an illustration of one, the Newdam ship, an Iron Age vessel found in Denmark. Boats can sometimes survive remarkably intact if the conditions in which they're buried or lost is favourably disposed towards them being so preserved. But as well as that, there's a fantastic amount of what I have called in other articles secondary source material. And I'm going to give you a list. There's a surprising number of them, and they also have certain advantages sometimes over the primary source material. One of the problems with the primary source material is we don't know necessarily how the boats were used. We rely on documentary evidence for that, and sometimes illustrations to show us how the boats were used. So primary and secondary source material comes together, hopefully at the end of the day, to present us with a full picture of ancient shipping. I'm going to deal first of all with some different primary source materials, how we come across the ancient boats themselves. Well, the first one, of course, is the actual shipwrecks. There are a lot of them in Northern Europe. As I say, they don't tend to survive in the waters around West Cornwall because of the nature of our coastline, but actual shipwrecks clearly are an important source of information. Vessels abandoned or allowed to become derelict, just forgotten about. And one place that I'm going to show you a slide of isn't a million miles away from here. Votive burials, obviously a North European tradition of burying not only important people, but sometimes very ordinary people with boats so they can continue on their journey in the afterlife. And the other one, when boats have been reused in other structures. And I'm going to give you some examples of each of those to show you how the information and the knowledge is gained. But I'm also going to give you this list of secondary source material. Not the boats themselves, but other ways that we find out about ancient boats. And as you can see, there's a surprising number of them. Well, the first one is documentary, written sources, where boats can be described, voyages can be described. And clearly, I've just mentioned Pytheas, the ancient Greek, and he describes how he made the journey from the Mediterranean up around the coast of Britain. So documentary information. Next one is stone carving, surprising number of those. Church architecture, pictures of Noah's Arks, some of the Gotland stones showing Viking ships. So stone carving is an important source. Models, the gold model that you may have noticed on the first slide that I put up, often votive as well, but sometimes toys. Manuscript illustrations, obviously from the medieval period, are very often a very informative source of information about boat types and about the way they were used. And of course, the one disadvantage that we have with the primary source material is that the rigging plans, the sails, generally do not survive very well in the archaeological record. We may have the hulls of the boats, the actual hull itself, but very often we have no idea of the sail plan that they use to propel themselves. Well, manuscript illustrations and illuminations are sometimes actually very informative about the rigging plans of ships. Wood carvings, again, very often ecclesiastical in origin, misericords in cathedrals, bench ends on churches, very often record early shipping. Tapestries, not very many of them, but the classic one, I hardly need mention, the Bayeux tapestry, has a huge number of illustrations, not only of the long ships being built before the invasion took place, but also of how they were sailed and propelled. So tapestries are another source. More for the classical period, mosaics. There are Roman period mosaic pavements in Britain that actually show illustrations of vessels. Presumably, the ones that they are showing would be classical and Mediterranean in origin rather than North European. Stained glass windows, again, mainly in cathedrals and big churches, but good sources of illustration for some aspects of medieval shipping. Coins. I think we're just about all of us old enough to remember the old halfpenny. And it had a picture on it of the Golden Hind. And it actually signals one of the problems that you have with secondary source material. somebody finding a halfpenny, say in 1,000-year time, would have assumed, presumably, given the date that's on it, that that's the sort of vessels that were being sailed around the British Isles in the 1960s. Well, we know it's an anachronism. So we have to sort of treat some of the secondary source material with a little degree of skepticism. Town seals, very important as well. I'll show you some of those. Tokens, monks' tokens, various other tokens, often with ship designs on them. Very important, wall murals. There is a very interesting mural in a church 5 miles from here. Some of you may know it. Brieg Church has a 14th century mural of a ship in it with some interesting illustrations about the way the ship was sailed, the sail plan. Metalwork, often hinges on doors were ornamented and give us some interesting information about ships. Portable objects, things that were carried. I've got a picture, I don't think I'm going to show it today, of an ampulla, a portable flask that was carried by pilgrims on the journey to Santiago de Compostela, and the one that I've got a picture of was found in an excavation I was involved in, Wood Quay in Dublin, and it's designed as a ship, and the sort of thing that obviously a pilgrim would have taken for carry holy water and to bless themselves. An interesting one, graffiti. Ship graffiti in churches is a fascinating topic in its own right. Medieval attitudes to graffiti are very different from contemporary attitudes to graffiti, and also the attitude of the people who did the graffiti was often very different. They weren't trying to vandalize and deface something. Often in churches, they were a form again of an offering for the hope that there would be a safe journey. So graffiti can be important. Replicas, building an example, a model of what we think they look like, and testing them is something that's really grown in the last 50 years. Replicas of Viking ships have been sailed. I worked for a few years in Greenwich, and we had various replicas built there at the National Maritime Museum and tested them to see how well they would sail, what they would be like to row, how well they grounded, how well they wore, the weak points. So building replicas is important. And finally, ethnography, the study of contemporary ships in other societies to see how they were used. So there's a fantastic amount of secondary source material available, building up a picture of how ships were used in the past. So the first of all to deal with shipwrecks. Some of you will recognize this picture. It's the SS Alba that went ashore on Porthmeor Beach in St Ives. Just over in this direction is the island, Porthmeor behind us, and that's the way to Manshead and Clodgey in the coastal footpath. The Alba went ashore in January 1938. I'm sure most of you know the story. The St Ives lifeboat was launched, took the men off, came clear, got hit by a wave and turned over. All the lifeboat crew were saved, but 6 men from the Alba were drowned. The tragedy of the Alba was that if they waited until the next morning, nobody need be drowned at all, because they could have got rope ladders over and climbed down. There was no need for the panic to get them off. The boat was still there some time later, and of course the boilers for the Alba are still there today, as every person who surfed in Porthmeor knows, watch out for the boilers. Of course, that's not true of wooden ships. Wooden ships broke up very quickly in the surf and generally left very little in the way of remains at all. And to illustrate that, I've got a picture of a ship that my family were linked with. The Sylph was a topsail schooner from my granny's family. She was a Williams, and this picture is in my possession. The picture was painted in 1866, date is there, Thomas James Williams Master. Very sadly, the Sylph was lost 3 years later on voyage from Barry to St Ives carrying coal, and she was lost off St Agnes Breakwater with a dreadful storm in March and lost with all hands. The whole family, bar one child, all the males of the family were lost in the shipwreck because the whole family were obviously crewing the ship. Now, the significant thing and the reason that I put the Sylph up, having explained the importance of seafaring, and archaeologists are very keen in written accounts these days to talk about the importance of seaways and the fact that they've been underestimated as means of communication. The one thing that archaeologists don't tend to emphasize is the attrition rate on ancient vessels. Now, I put this up because on the day that the Sylph was lost, I've got an account of when she was lost in the Western Gazette. I think 12 other vessels were lost in Cornwall, and a lot of lives were lost, not just the crew of the Sylph. It didn't even make the front page of the Western Gazette on that day. It was on the inside cover. On the front page, there was a lot of reference to the damage done to farmers and barns. So it gives you some idea of the relative commonplace of ship losses. And I've read recently about the Great Storm, August Storm of 1823. This is staggering. 180 vessels were lost in one day during the Great Storm of August 1823 between Land's End and Hartland Point. Now, if you think of 180 vessels being lost, the loss of life must have been tremendous. So seafaring, ancient seafaring, was always a perilous activity. Important, yes, but one shouldn't talk glibly about crossing seaways. Anyway, to get on to, in a sense, a more ancient wreck, a few years ago when I was working at the National Maritime Museum, I was seconded to the National Museum Denmark, and I was taken to a place called the Kattegat, a place called Viberstrand, which is on the north coast of Denmark, overlooking the sea, and across the other side is Sweden. And it looks lovely on a photograph like this, beautiful, clear waters, a Danish fishing boat going out. But just below the coast, a wreck was found. And if you look carefully, you can see the outline of the wreck here. That's the timber. And that's the ballast that kept the boat upright. 14th century sailing vessel. And the reason I put this up, apart from the fact I was involved in it, is that to illustrate that there is a Cornish connection, the ballast is granite. And the granite was Cornish granite. So this vessel, and whatever type of vessel it was called a cog, 14th century, actually came to Cornwall at some point in its journeyings and loaded granite as ballast before she was lost. Clearly dated by use of dendrochronology tree ring analysis and by the fact that she was carrying 180 gold coins. So that's the Viberstrand wreck in Denmark. The next slide, it illustrates the fact that we had to work on that boat underwater. This actually isn't working on the Viberstrand wreck. This is the Canningen gives it away. This is the wreck of the La Trinidad Valenciero, one of the Spanish Armada wrecks off the coast of Ireland. But clearly, in favourable circumstances, considerable amounts of ship's timber can be found under the water, and obviously the apparel that went with it, hence the Mary Rose, perhaps the most famous of all the underwater wrecks in British ship archaeology at the moment. And the Viberstrand wreck was eventually raised and put onto a pontoon, a platform, taken to the Ship Museum at Roskilde, and has been preserved, and parts of it have been reconstructed, like the Mary Rose, but much earlier and a much smaller vessel. Abandoned vessels, those are the shipwrecks. Surprising number of vessels are abandoned and forgotten about. I'm sure you all recognise this place, and some of you may even recognise the boat, because it's actually significant in the history of Cornwall. It's the Rosebud. And those of you that know your Cornish history will know that the Rosebud was very important, because this was the fishing boat that went from Newlyn up the Thames to Westminster to protest about the Newlyn, let's call them the clearances, the proposed clearances of all the cottages in Newlyn. And the Rosebud was there for years and years and years, actually. I didn't know it was the Rosebud until relatively recently. I was talking to somebody and they pointed out this was the Rosebud. So this is a relatively recent example of abandoned vessels. As a kid, I could never understand why you own a boat and forget about it and leave it up in the saltings up at Lelant and not care about it. Well, as an adult, I know how that happens, because we've had a boat go to pieces up there, and my cousin has as well. So it's one of those things that for various reasons actually is quite a commonplace. And the next slide shows you an ancient one. I worked on this when I was at Greenwich. This was a boat found in the North Kent marshes, the Graveney boat it was called, and she's dated to 950 AD, an Anglo-Saxon seagoing vessel, and she was found in the silt. She'd been abandoned in a kind of little backwater in the North Kent marshes, and she was preserved virtually up to what would have been gunwale level, and a significant amount of her was raised, and she was taken to the National Maritime Museum, and the timbers were kept waterlogged in the hope that she would eventually be reconstructed. So that's the 950 AD vessel that was abandoned in North Kent marshes. And of course, some of the most spectacular ancient boat finds, and these would have been seen around the coast of Cornwall, are the great Viking ship burials. There's a whole series of them been found. This is the Gokstad ship, possibly one of the best preserved and most famous of all. And she was buried with a queen, Queen Asa, in 890 AD. And she's now on display in the ship museum at Bygde in Oslo, together with two other ships, the Oseberg ship and the June ship. If you ever get the chance to go to Oslo, it's a must to go and see the Viking ship museum there. So votive burials are an important source, not only in Northern Europe or on the mainland of Scandinavia, but also, of course, in Britain. This is the Sutton Hoo ship burial, and she was found in 1939, just before the outbreak of the Second War, and of course the film has been made about the Sutton Hoo excavations now. And she's been dated by various bits of evidence, mainly numismatic evidence, coin evidence found in the centre part where there was a burial chamber. Let's go back again. This area here, there was a burial chamber. There's often been conjecture whether there was actually a burial in it, because the soil is very acidic and the bones would have actually been lost. But there were traces of bones there, so it's very likely that there was somebody buried there. And the candidate that comes up most often is a character called Redwald. Anyway, this is the Sutton Hoo ship. None of the timbers actually survived. What you actually got with Sutton Hoo was a cast of where the timbers had been that had hardened in the sand. So the evidence here wasn't of the actual wood itself, but of the impression that it left, like a plaster cast, but in hard sand, in the actual burial tumuli. And reused ship's timbers, well, perhaps the most spectacular example of reused ship's timbers, something else that I was involved in. I did my degree in Ireland, and I worked for several years on the Wood Quay excavations in Dublin. For those of you that know Dublin, this is the Protestant cathedral, Christchurch Cathedral up on the hill. Up that way, very importantly, is the Guinness Brewery. And it used to emit a fantastic... It's the one thing that kept us going when there was very good, the smell of the Guinness Brewery. And behind where this photograph was taken is the River Liffey, and very close behind where the photograph was taken. So all of these features here are actually a whole series of wooden quays. And the area that was excavated was truly massive. It was, in every sense, a rescue excavation. And it was really about salvaging as much material as possible before the developers went in to build office blocks. And it was actually scandalous what happened at Wood Quay. I won't go into the politics of it. But what was important was the nature of some of these structures were reused ship's timbers of Viking Age date. And here you can see, slightly younger me, it was taken a couple of years ago, said with a smile. We're carrying some of the timbers that were down here up for a closer examination in the hope that we could restore them and reconstruct them. And just to give you some idea of the quality of the actual timber preservation, here it is. This is where part of a ship had been dismantled and used as a revetment to keep the banks from falling into the river. There's an interesting example of that in metal, again, not very far away from here. Some of you will know it, Dynamite Quay, where there's remains of World War I warships have been broken up and actually used as a revetment down on Dynamite Quay. Well, obviously here, the same sort of thing took place using parts of a wooden ship. Now, the interesting thing about these timbers, and they obviously reflect a Viking Age vessel, is it an example of Viking shipbuilding, or is it an example of Irish shipbuilding? Are we dealing with a Scandinavian ship here or an Irish ship? And actually, when you come to ponder it, it's very difficult to determine what it is. And together with a chap called Mike Bailey, who was a tree-ring specialist at Queen's, he was a professor of paleoecology, he and I wrote a paper. There is only one way, I think, that you can begin to work out whether it's this material is Irish or Scandinavian in origin. And if you ponder that, you might like to tell me at the end of the talk whether you've cracked the way of doing it. But it's an interesting one. Ships by their nature can travel long ways away from where they were built. Another source of information about shipping, and this is one of the most famous ones of all in terms of medieval archaeology, is that Roskilde Fjord in Denmark. At the entrance to the fjord here, a whole series of Viking Age vessels were sunk to blockade the fjord from attack from outsiders. So they attempted to block the narrow channel and entrance to Roskilde Fjord in Denmark by sinking a whole series of Viking Age ships. And you can see that they, unlike the Wood Quay excavation, actually had the infrastructure and the money to do the job properly. And so they built a cofferdam around where the ships had been found, pumped the water out, and then used the spray material to keep the timbers damp until they could be lifted and restored properly. So that's the Skulde of ships which date to the 11th century AD. The Maiden boat, the boat of Farrell, Iron Age date, found in Denmark. 3 of them were found in one of the peat bogs in Denmark. And what I'm going to ask you to do is just kind of take a mental note of what these vessels are like, because they've all got one characteristic in common so far. Actually 2 characteristics in common, and I'll see if anyone spotted what they were. Anyway, the Maiden boat, 3 of them were found. They were in a museum in the southern part of Denmark, and then during the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon marched in and destroyed 2 of them, so there's only 1 of them left now. So even ancient material has been subject sometimes to hostile activity. That's the Maiden boat, and you can see virtually intact. And this is another example of the same sort of thing. This boat is in very good condition because we're still working on it. And Jim, you'll recognise what it is. It's one of the jumbos, one of the luggers that have been built recently by Johnny Nance. And it's a reconstruction of the sort of sailing vessels that were used in the fishing industry, luggers that sailed out of St. Ives, say 100 years ago. Now, the one thing this has got in common with all the other boats is, have anybody spotted it? They're clinker built. Okay, so when you look at this lugger and the constructional technique used to build this boat, and I'll explain what I mean by clinker building in a minute, then this is exactly the same as all the other vessels that we've seen so far. The continuity of the clinker built tradition goes back really several hundreds, if not thousands of years in Northern Europe, and has remained unchanged essentially in all that time. And the other characteristic is indicated by this boat. They're what we call double-ended. That's to say, obviously they're pointed at the bow, and they're also pointed at the stern. So the characteristic boat type, right from prehistory until the luggers of St. Ives and West Cornwall into the last 100 years, were double-ended, clinker-built boats. And this is a Nordland boat. Nordland is one of the northern provinces of Norway, and these are the sort of fishing boats that were used off the northern coast of Norway until 100 years ago. At the same time, we were sailing luggers here in Cornwall. They were sailing these square-rigged, double-ended, clinker-built boats off the north coast of Norway. I did have the privilege of sailing on one of those once, and what struck me was the sheer weight of everything they carried. And of course, the other thing that will strike you is they're open boats. There's no shelter at all. And these men were fishing up in the Arctic Circle in these vessels in all weathers in open boats with no protection at all. And I have to say, at one point we had to row the boat out of the fjord. Just lifting the oar was quite a task in itself. And I'm staggered at the sort of endurance these characters must have had. Anyway, that's the Nordland boat. And as I say, you can see double-ended, single square sail, clinker built. And this is another area that I'm familiar with, County Donegal. This is, you see again, double-ended boat, pointed at the bow, pointed at the stern there. This case, slightly different sail rig, it's got a dipping lug, but clinker built, and they were called dromfums, and they were still built until recently in County Donegal, because they were modelled off boats from Trondheim, Norway. So we're dealing with a kind of a cultural boat building tradition that extends really all the way up the west coast of Britain, as far as Scandinavia, and includes Ireland. So this is a dromfum from County Donegal. And you can see the obvious parallel with the jumbos of St. Ives. So the remarkable thing about these luggers, these clinker-built luggers, and the jumbo is a classic example, a smaller version of some of them, is the long-standing tradition that has brought them about, and was still, the important boat type in Cornwall until 100 years ago, and not dissimilar from the Drontham of Donegal. And even the small boats, this is what's called a fairing, that means a four-oared boat, from the Gutstad burial. And when I was an undergraduate, I had to hike up through Sweden to get to Oslo, and this is a photograph I took of a small boat in just north of Gotland in West Sweden. And you can see even the small boats are built on the same principle, double-ended, clinker built. So that tradition is of long-standing origin in all the boats that we would have expected to see around Cornwall throughout prehistory and throughout the medieval into the recent past as well. Now, just to sort of try and show you that there are two basic boat building techniques used, and I'll try and keep this as simple as I can. It has become more of a commonplace in terms of boat building in Cornwall to refer to boats either as carvel built or clinker built. And for the lay person, a carvel built boat has a smooth exterior. All the planks are laid edge to edge. Clinker built boat is kind of like garden fencing. The planks overlap. They're stepped on the outside like a garden shed. Now, clinker built boats were the commonest type used around Cornwall throughout, as I say, the historical and prehistoric period.